A free camera, one that has no target, behaves more like a camera in the real world. And whether it's a physical free camera or a standard free camera, we'll need to take a couple extra steps in order to make that camera operate like it's on a tripod. By default, that's not going to be the case. Additionally, unless you take some extra steps, you might encounter some serious issues, especially around animation. Now, let's demonstrate. If I select this free physical camera and activate the Rotate tool, by default we'll be in View Coordinate System, which is essentially the World Coordinate System. And I can rotate around the world Z-axis in this perspective view or in the top view, and that works just fine. No problem with that. But if I try to rotate in another direction in View Coordinate System, I'm going to have some serious problems. I'm immediately going to get something called a Dutch tilt or a canted angle. I'll undo that with Control Z. That's happening because, as we can see very clearly in the top view, the rotate gizmo is not aligned with the camera. It's aligned with the world. Most people would immediately switch over to local coordinates so that the gizmo is oriented with the camera. And at first blush, that would seem to work fine. Let's try it. We'll switch our reference coordinate system over to local. And we see now that the rotate gizmo is aligned with the object. So far, so good. We could tilt in the local x-axis. No problem there. Undo that with Control Z. We can pan around the local y-axis. No problem there. Again, undo. The problem starts to come in when we try to combine pan and tilt. So for example, let's say I tilt down or tilt up. I'll tilt down and maybe move the camera up a little bit just so we can frame this a little bit better. So I've got the camera tilted down, and I'll go back to my rotate tool in local coordinates and then try to pan around the local y-axis. I'll right-click in that perspective view so I don't lose my selection and click on the green y-axis to try to pan. And immediately, once again, I get that Dutch tilt or canted angle. The camera is now rotated around its own line of sight. So we don't want that. Let's undo that with Control Z. The takeaway here is that we can't combine pan and tilt using local coordinates. Pan rotation around the local y-axis is fine as long as there's no tilt. But that limits us quite a lot. One possible solution to this would be to switch the reference coordinate system when we're rotating in different axes. Rotating around the local x-axis for tilt seems to work just fine. If I want to pan without getting a Dutch tilt, I can rotate around the world z-axis. So I'll switch back over to View or even World, just to be in explicit world coordinates. And now I can rotate around the world z-axis, and I don't get that Dutch tilt. But if I want to go back to tilting, I'll need to switch back to local coordinates. And then I can tilt, and that's fine. Well, that seems like a solution, but that's kind of a waste of time to switch back and forth between all of those coordinate systems. And additionally, we won't be able to see that right now, but if we do it this way, it will cause problems with animation. Rotations won't behave predictably, and the object will spin around in crazy directions. The solution is just don't use local mode. Use Gimbal coordinate system. We'll switch over to Gimbal. And we notice that the axes change color. And now the x-axis is tilt, but the z-axis is pan. Whereas in local mode, the z-axis is the Dutch tilt, and the y-axis is pan. Okay, so that should be an indication that there's something very different going on when we switch to Gimbal coordinate system. Local is not the true rotation space of the object. It does not accurately represent the complex interactions of rotational axes. We'll talk about this more in the next movie, but for now it's enough to know that Gimbal mode will prevent those problems that we saw in local mode. It just so happens that Gimbal mode works fine for a camera as long as we don't have a Dutch tilt. So if we rotate around Gimbal Z, we're panning. If we rotate around Gimbal X, we're tilting, and we don't have any problem combining those. But if we do introduce a Dutch tilt by rotating around the gimbal y-axis, then we're going to have problems. And not just because we've got a canted angle or a Dutch tilt. That's a problem in itself. But if we look at the rotate gizmo very carefully, as we rotate around the gimbal y-axis, we can see that the red x-axis is moving, but the blue z-axis is not. And we can get into a situation here known as gimbal lock that limits our freedom and could cause serious problems. In the following movie, we'll see how to control the rotational axes to optimize the rotation priority to emulate the mechanics of a tripod. That's the importance of gimbal mode for rotations of a free camera.